No role plays, just real. Chris and Lorenzo share 4 decades of combined experience to help you become a more effective leader.
We've never really, as a workforce, spent a lot of time on making sure we're developing good leaders.
We'll be able to share stories, experience, mistakes, failures, successes.
This is Hacking Your Leadership.
Welcome to Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lorenzo.
And Lorenzo, on this episode, I want to talk about having a common enemy.
Okay.
Kind of a weird topic when it comes to leadership. You would think, what do you mean a common enemy? Some of our listeners are probably old enough to remember where they were when 9/11 happened. And one of the things that I remember in the aftermath of 9/11 for a few months is that there was a precipitous drop in crime, property crime, violent crime in amongst the people of the United States. And it was largely attributed to this idea of having a common enemy. For a certain point in time, we all kind of decided that there was a force or an enemy that was greater than all of us, that if we didn't work together to defeat, that it was going to defeat us. And it started making people look at each other as on the same team as opposed to inherently on a different team. People looked across, the different demographics that they would normally not be on the same team as, and it was kind of like this interesting moment in time that I think a lot of good came out of it. I was kind of unfortunate when I think it kind of went away, but I see this in a lot of leadership teams too. And here's what I'll give you a perfect example. I'm consulting for an organization right now where there are some changes that need to happen. There are some kind of like long-standing things that they've always been kind of against the rules, but they've been allowed to happen over time. Almost like how if the speed limit's 65, you drive 72. And if all of a sudden you started getting it makes sense you'd get a speeding ticket at 90, but if all of a sudden people started getting tickets at 66 instead of 65, there'd be this like outrage, like, what? I've been doing this for the longest time, right? So when it comes to making changes like this on a leadership team, what I'm experiencing or witnessing right now is the leadership team kind of collectively decided that there was a person who would be better at kind of making these changes. And what it was basically is that person was kind of okay at delivering hard feedback. They are kind of viewed already as a person who has less empathy, easier to have those tough conversations. And then you have the rest of the leadership team who doesn't like having those tough conversations, and so they get that person gets anointed to kind of like take the charge. And I'm seeing how it might work in the short term, but there could be some long-term negative implications on this. For this team, but it happens across the workforce. What are your thoughts on this? Have you ever seen this kind of this theory of the common enemy play out in a leadership team?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think any like dynamic of a group or a team, there's always going to be those that are more aligned in certain aspects, and there will be those that have a different perspective or a different way of approaching things. And I think when you're thinking about building teams with diverse backgrounds, experiences, perspectives, things like that. Like that's actually a part of the expectation is that there will be people that are more comfortable with certain aspects of the job and the role than others, and maybe more experienced with it and more capable of delivering things. But I think what ends up happening in a lot of teams, though, is that there may be this common trait of maybe you have outgoing personalities on your team. You have a lot of people that kind of walk in to rooms with a lot of energy and positivity and how's things going? How was your weekend? And, they're really, really kind of outgoing in that aspect.
Yeah, type A. Yeah.
Type A, right?
Yep.
Versus another leader who might walk in and just say, "Hey, how you doing? Good to see you," and just keep walking. And it's not that they don't have the same type of want or need or curiosity or connection. It's just that that's who they are and their approach. And if you just look on the surface of those two things, you may say something like, "Oh wow, like Chris walks in every day and he's just so positive and he's got this energy and he says hi and he stops and he talks to me for 30 seconds and he keeps it moving and it's so awesome. We love him." Lorenzo walks in and he just waves and says hi and keeps going on about his day. And like, I'll talk to him later, but he doesn't, it's different. It's different when he's here. It's a different environment. It's a different vibe. And like, yeah, that's actually, that can happen. That doesn't necessarily mean that that I'm doing something wrong, or that I have to show up the same way that Chris does. But over time, if that doesn't change, over time, if there's not some type of a little bit of a middle ground, if Chris doesn't figure out ways to make sure that he's not only positive and energetic and bringing this element, but he's also making sure that he's balancing that with maybe harder conversations or accountability. If Lorenzo doesn't stop and pause and start to build relationships in his own way, and maybe doesn't walk in with a whole bunch of energy, but spends more time connecting with people while they're on the floor or on the job or in the office, like actually building quality relationships. If those things don't happen, there becomes this kind of a very clear divide in styles. And I think that can cause people to say, like, well, when Chris is here, it's one way. When Lorenzo here, it's a different way. And we like Chris's style more than Lorenzo's style. So therefore, Lorenzo may not be a great leader, or we may have feedback, or we may feel a certain way about him. So in your example, like that person who is good at or is okay with delivering tough conversations or feedback or coaching, if they constantly volunteer for that work, they may find themselves as the common enemy because they're the only ones giving that type of dialogue to the team.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think that the interesting part about your example is that it could just as easily be decided that Lorenzo is the good leader and Chris isn't, because the team is the kind of person, the team that you're dealing with are the kind of people who, when Chris walks in all energetic and happy and positive, that the response is, "Ugh, why is he always so energetic and positive?" Like,
exactly.
I like it when Lorenzo's here better. He just leaves me alone, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so this isn't an indictment on one type of leadership skill or another. This is that no matter who you are as a person, you will find yourself gravitating towards one type or the other. And so when it comes to teams with multiple leaders, this is where it can become a problem. If the buck stops with one person, if you have one boss and you don't have a team of leaders, or you're not a leader of leaders, this is less likely to happen, because at the end of the day, you have that one boss and you kind of have to deal with that. But when you have situations like in our background in terms of a retail environment, where you could have a person who is an individual contributor or a line level employee, and depending on the day, they may have one of 3 or 6 or 10 different leaders that they are working with or dealing with, they will absolutely have a hierarchy. They will be able to, in a 30-second period, be able to organize the list of all their leadership names from their favorite to their least favorite, and there will be 1 or 2 that is a very easily top, and 1 or 2 very easily at the bottom, and the rest might be a little bit more difficult to kind of fall into the middle, or they're kind of like inconsequential to that person in that person's mind. But I think in a lot of leadership teams, the reason why this is likely to happen is because we see, one, inherent value in diversity of leadership style, right? If all the leaders are exactly the same, then they'll find themselves resonating with some employees, but not all employees, and that's a good way to disengage some employees. If there's a variety, if there's different leaders that have different styles or different ways of doing things, the collective of them is likely to make sure that every employee has a leader that they find themselves being able to gravitate towards. And that can seem really like a positive, and it is a positive, but it underscores the importance of having a baseline of certain skills and certain leadership qualities that everybody has to bring to the table. The leader that I'm talking about, who is better or doesn't mind delivering the tough conversations, that doesn't mean the rest of that leadership team is off the hook from having to deliver those tough conversations, because that means that the person who is delivering all the conversations is going to be viewed as the bad leader by anybody who doesn't like hearing tough feedback, and the rest of the team gets off the hook. They get to remain with the best friends with the team, with the rest of the employees, and not feel like they're hurting their relationship with them, all while getting the benefits of the accountability that comes from this peer of theirs who kind of like, falls on their sword. And I say falls on their sword intentionally, because at the end of the day, that's what will happen. That leader who ends up being the one who's delivering those tough conversations will be the one who is ousted by the team as not a good leader, when in actuality, the rest of the team probably should have stepped it up too.
Yeah, and I think there's elements of that where it gets confusing or becomes a gray area, is that same style of directiveness or clarity or accountability or that type of thing, a lot of people actually appreciate that over time. So like what they appreciate is that you're not beating around the bush. It's you're not trying to sugarcoat anything. And then they realize that when they take that and then they maybe put into action some of the feedback or the behaviors, they become more successful. That many times they will really appreciate that leader. The kicker as to what you underlined was like the larger team collectively, though. It's the difference between leaders that the leadership team really gets judged upon. So like if you have a collection of leaders, as a larger team looking at them, when you hear things like they're not aligned, they don't communicate well, they don't, there's a difference in the environment when some leaders are here, some leaders are there. What a larger team is looking at is the delta in variance between each leader and how they show up collectively for those individuals. So if you and I are on the same team and you and I are really clear about a message, or we approach the work the same way, or even though we come with different ideas and different perspectives, we know that this thing we should be relatively consistent with and how we handle it, how we deal with it. And then there's another leader over here that's a little bit up and down, or doesn't do the same exact thing that we do, or they feel like they're not on the same page, they're not informed as well, whatever the case is. From a team perspective, they say the leadership team is not aligned.
Right.
Because there's a difference in how we're approaching certain things. Now, the reality is there's always going to be differences. There should be. And there's always going to be ways that we handle things or approach things in a different way. What I'm talking about, though, are kind of like the things that should be relatively consistent. When we make a decision to do something in regards to a client or a customer or an exception, things like that, like we should be relatively in the same ballpark about how we handle that and then how we go about making the decision. And if we're good with that, then I think that's very, very helpful. It's when you have a leader or somebody who says, I would do that, but that's a lot more work, or I would do that, but I really don't want to have to spend the time figuring that thing out. I'm going to take the easy route and make this call, versus other leaders who are doing the work. That's when you start to run into trouble, and that's when the team starts to say, wait a minute, they're not aligned, they're not consistent.
Right. And when it comes to holding people accountable, that can be a really, really big deal, because if there is a large enough percentage of the employee base that just doesn't, that in general just views accountability towards getting the job done as inherently negative, meaning that they're being held accountable to a result or to a certain behavior that maybe doesn't come naturally to them, something where they have to actually work at to get this part of their job done. It means that now the job is more than just I just show up and do whatever the basic minimum is and still get paid and everything's fine. Now I have to actually change something about myself or change something about the way I show up or my behavior, and that doesn't inherently feel good. So instead of taking that and going, all right, let's see what I can do to make this change or make this difference, I now say, all right, well, I need to make sure that I make this change or this difference when this leader is around, but when the other parts of leadership team are around, that doesn't matter as much. And that's where the problem happens. If there are 5 people who are on the same leadership team and they want to all collectively decide to delegate the accountability to the one leader who has an easier time or doesn't mind having the tough conversations, if the delivery of the conversation, the one-on-one conversation that says this thing needs to change is done by one person, by itself that isn't inherently a negative thing. But the follow-up on the behaviors needs to be lockstep, meaning the next time that a person who didn't have that conversation witnesses the same behavior happening, that person pulls the employee aside and says, hey, I know that you had this conversation with this person. I just want to know, talk to me about what happened there. What happened there, or why it was different. What that does is it says, oh, they talk to each other. Like, oh my gosh, that is a good thing. You don't necessarily have to be the best at delivering the tough conversation to make this work out. You can work as a leadership team to figure out who can work with their strengths to do the delivery or to do this element of it. It's the general impression about what does the team feel about the leadership team as a whole, and do they see weaknesses in the armor? Do they see places in the chainmail they can poke holes through to kind of separate out? Because that's what they will do. They will naturally find those holes, and they will separate the team. And eventually, what will happen is the leadership team will start becoming resentful towards each other because of the feeling of a lack of alignment that they actually brought on themselves.
Absolutely. So let me ask you a question, because as we've been talking about this, I've been in my own head thinking about a time when maybe I was the common enemy. So was there ever a time in your career where you would say, like, you know what, there's a good chance that at that point I may have been the common enemy?
Yeah, so I can think of, and I did this the wrong way. I was looked at as a positive force on a team of people, and instead of using that to talk to my peers on a leadership team and say, this is what I'm hearing, this is what I'm seeing, I would love to know your feedback too. Let's figure out where I'm lacking, and let's figure out where you're lacking, and let's get together. Instead, I kind of embraced that as like, oh, I'm the one that people like. I wasn't necessarily bad mouthing my peers, but I was kind of allowing the relationship to deteriorate between the employees and my peers in a way that made me feel like, all right, if it came down to it, like vote somebody off the island Survivor style, I'll be the last one voted off. And I looked at that as like kind of a positive thing, not even realizing that maybe the reason why they are looking on me positively is not because of something I'm good at, but rather something I'm not good at that they don't like either. And so, yeah, it is absolutely a double-edged sword. And because everybody kind of naturally gravitates towards the things that they are good at, it can be difficult to see your own blind spots in the moment. And so that's why it's incredibly important to have this an amazing communication rhythm when it comes to people who are peers on the same leadership team, because there will be a lot of interactions that occur when you're not around. If you're not the only leader and you have peers, you can't rely on that. The only delivery of leadership, of accountability, of praise, of all these things isn't just siloed through you. There's a lot of people are going to be doing this, and inconsistencies will be picked apart.
Absolutely. And with that, it brings us this episode's 1 minute hack. But first, a few words from our sponsors.
The 1 minute hack.
All right, for this episode's 1 minute hack, here's what I want you to do. I want you to write down 4 words on a piece of paper. I want you to write down positivity, accountability, competence, and recognition. And then I want you to think about the leaders that you either report up to or that are on your peer team, if you're on a team of leaders, or if you're a leader of leaders, the people who report up to you. I want you to write down the names of the people on those teams who you think are known for each of those things: the competence, positivity, accountability. Write down those names. If you're able to do that fairly easily, that means that there is likely a common enemy on your team. There's likely a person who is viewed as the one that no one wants to be around because they only hold people accountable. You're likely to have a person on your team who people might enjoy being around, but maybe they're not good at holding people accountable. All of those things can drive wedges between your leadership teams. And that means that you need to sit down with your peers, or the people who report to you, or there are people that you report up to, and talk with them about the importance of making sure that there is a baseline of alignment when it comes to the employee and the customer experience. If you can do that, then while you might have different leadership styles, there won't be this kind of space between the leadership team that individual employees or groups of employees can drive wedges between, and you're likely to have this cohesion that leads to support of each other, as opposed to one of your team being ousted by the rest.
Yeah, I think it's a great 1 minute hack, and what you're looking to discover here is that if you have standouts in any one of those 4 categories, if you're like, oh my gosh, it's this person, then there's probably the Mr. Glass, for those of you that are fans of Unbreakable, the opposites of somebody else on the team potentially. That's kind of the other side of that. So when you have those big standouts and those individuals that really stand strong in those 4 things, chances are there's somebody else who doesn't. And that delta between the two in a lot of teams is how people will look at the larger team, and then by default how they will start to define different leaders, and then by default you'll have a leader who may not be able to, that may be on their own kind of, or may end up, especially like the one when it comes to accountability. If you have a standout leader that you're like, oh, this person like number one in accountability, they might be the common enemy if other people fill in the other three, or if there's nobody next to them or close enough to them in their output of behaviors to make sure that the team understands that we are consistent across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. This is all about contrasting. Every person, just the human nature is that we judge things in the context of how they vary from what we think a baseline is, or what is available. It's why people think they got a good deal on a car if they know other people who paid more. It has nothing to do with what they actually paid. It's why no one thinks that I don't want to say no one, it's a generalization, but it's why a lot of people don't think they're not being paid enough until they find other people who are being paid more. Then all of a sudden they're not being paid enough. It's the context of what is my experience versus the experience of others. Because if the experience amongst everybody is the same or really similar, it's less likely to cause problems, or that delta between the two is less likely to be called out.
Absolutely. And with that, it brings us to the end of this episode. This is Hacking Your Leadership, a Speaker Prime podcast. I'm Lorenzo.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you all next time.